Hi everybody, welcome to topic 1 of Unit 2. Unit 2, cleverly numbered Unit 2 because it's the second one we'll be going through over the course of the semester. Here we're introducing the concept of sports space, and sports space is pretty important to understand sort of the applications of the politicization of sports as we go through the rest of the semester. This was developed almost 20 years ago now by a trio of academics who were exploring the concept of sports and trying to set up a way to measure the impact of sports either on the society or to be predictive about when sports might be used by governments politically or other entities politically. And they're trying to see if sports space, if the number of sports is like infinite that a society could care about, if it's limited, like what that looks like. And we'll really be diving into this concept in a general sense in topic 1 and in topic 2. And if by chance you come to the end of topic 2 and you don't yet really understand what I'm talking about, what they're talking about, please hit the pause button on the unit, call me, email me, come by the office. Let's talk and make sure you understand sports space, because really the rest of the semester, especially the rest of units 2 and 3, depend on you understanding what sports space is. So be in touch. Maybe you won't have to, because I'll be so good at teaching that it'll be all clear. So let's dive in. So let's start here. Let's start here with the Argentine junta, a military dictatorship that ran Argentina in the late 70s and early 80s, and enacted something called the Dirty War that coincided with World Cup 1978. Essentially, the concept of sports space is trying to determine whether a sport or an event can be politicized or used to certain ends, or to predict whether it could be. And the story of the Dirty War, which was a conflict waged against its own citizens by the military dictatorship. In other words, they took the part of the populace that they considered subversive or undesirable and went after them without any care to any sort of procedural interest or anything. They disappeared tens of thousands of people, and as many as 30,000 people were killed in a few-year period. They happened to be hosting World Cup 1978, and because of sports and what I would call the sports effect, the majority of people around the world who may or may not have paid any attention at all to what the junta was doing in Argentina. I mean, you can imagine how few countries you're paying attention to right now, and whether there's human rights abuses or problems happening there. If there's something in your interest, in your sphere of interest, that is happening in that country, the chances are that the effect of that interest that you have may lead you to understand stories and pay attention to things that are happening differently than you would if you didn't have that interest. So in this case, because sports is in the sphere of influence or sphere of interest of so many people, there's an effect that means that a lot more people are paying attention to what the Argentine junta was doing in Argentina because they were going to host the World Cup than those who wouldn't. So, for example, there's stories in Sports Illustrated in the United States. This was the main sports journalism outlet. There weren't a lot of Americans who cared about soccer in the 1970s, but a general sports fan would then become familiar with the junta because they were reading their magazine each week. So the sports effect causes you to engage in this. But the junta also knew that if they were successful at staging the World Cup, that people would not care so much about what had happened. That in advance of the tournament, lots of people would care and put pressure on them. That after the tournament or during the tournament, people would say, hey, those guys, they did some interesting stuff. For example, here you have some images of Argentina winning the 1978 World Cup, and even though they had done some dastardly things that were truly horrific, and people paid a lot of attention before it, during it, the Argentine people themselves were celebrating. What were they celebrating? Not the junta, but the junta could take advantage of it. They were celebrating the win of their soccer team in the World Cup tournament they were hosting. And all of that coverage, the sports effect coverage, sort of changes the narrative about the junta from this really terrible regime that had been murdering tens of thousands of their own citizens and disappearing many more, to one where the fans are chanting their names and celebrating, and there's flags flying. And I remember reading one quote where a Time magazine journalist said, you know, I came here expecting blood and horror in the streets, and instead, the thing I'm most in danger of being danced with against my will by all these celebrating people. And so that sports effect allows the junta both to convince their own people who were in the midst of being repressed and the people of the world who were discussed with them in advance that things weren't so bad. And that does go away after the tournament, but it gives them a chance during this hosting to sort of change the narrative, and it's because of the sports effect. So sports space is trying to determine, can that happen with other sports? Can it happen with other events in Argentina, or what does that look like? So here's a pocket definition. I call it a pocket definition because, I don't know, I think you could write it down and put it in your pocket. And when you had spare time, you could look at it and study it and see, what is sports space. So this is written, if you don't want to write this down, you can copy it off of the introductory, the homepage of Unit 2. And you can see what it might mean. So one of the keys is that it's not about participation. It's about a sport that will motivate people to do something else. So it can be very confusing to look at participation and say, look, there's so many youth soccer players in the United States. In fact, there's more registered soccer players than any other sport. Therefore, soccer must be in the U.S. sports space. And it's not true, because that participation does not yet lead people to do things politically, economically, socially, emotionally, or some other context because of their involvement in that game. So that's the key. Does it motivate you? And so I want to tell you a tale now of motivation in this context, and this is from my own life. We're going to flash back to 1997 when Microsoft billionaire Paul Allen offered to buy the Seattle Seahawks. The Seattle Seahawks were a decently supported team, but they had a terrible stadium in the Kingdom. That's its picture here. There were rumors that they were going to move. There are lots of communities around the United States that are interested in having a team come. And he said he would buy them and keep them in Seattle if, and only if, the taxpayers of the state of Seattle would pay for the construction of a new football stadium. Excuse me, I had to pause to cough there. So what he proposed was a state-of-the-art stadium that now is called Lumen Field in Seattle. So I just gave away the way to land. Guess what? The Seahawks are still in Seattle, and they play in Lumen Field. At least that's the sponsor as of 2021. So it was going to be a $300 million tax bill to the citizens of the state of Washington, and we were allowed to vote. So they did some polling, and they realized that the initiative was going to go down to defeat, that about 48% of Washingtonians cared enough about NFL football and cared enough about the Seahawks that they wanted to tax themselves to keep the stadium. But that's not enough to win. So they did some additional polling, and they found that approximately 3% more of the population of Washington, me included, were willing to tax themselves to pay for the stadium if they added soccer to the vision of how they were going to design the stadium, that they could attract a Major League Soccer team, a U.S. Women's League Soccer team, and host World Cup games. And now, for me, who's got soccer in a sports space, this is fantastic. And what I decide is that I'm motivated to act. That changes my vote for one that's a nay, because I'm not interested in taxing myself to pay for an NFL stadium, but I am interested in paying taxes to pay for a soccer stadium. And so they go from basically 52 to 48 a defeat to what ends up being 51.5 to 48.5 pass. So this is it. So the stadium gets built, and the Seattle Sounders play there now. And pretty soon the United States is going to be hosting games in World Cup 2026. It's presumed that we'll be hosting games in Seattle, and my goofy dream will have come true. I've seen now the U.S. play there a couple of times. I've seen the Sounders play. It's fantastic. So that's sort of the key, is when you look at this definition, if we flash back to the definition here, you say, does it motivate someone to do something? That's what it means. Are you willing to sort of engage your own personal interest in doing that? And in my case, it means more than that. It means, deciding, does the team that's the companies that sponsor my team, if it's Continental Tire, should I buy Continental Tires? Should I invest with those people? Do healthcare at the places that sponsor my team? Like, what is that relationship? And it does motivate me to act in a different way. So that doesn't mean that soccer's in the U.S. It just means it's in my sports space. And if you looked in the United States at the thing that's replicated in the most sports spaces across the country, well, on a personal, local, or regional context, there's lots of sports. Anything on a personal level, it's endless. So that would mean that if you're a squash player and you really care about squash, that you could be motivated by it, but you might be one of a handful of people at a university. You could run track. You could be really into track and field. My daughter grew up rowing crew and was very interested in sort of what happened on policies relating to the lower Snake River Dam and the facilities on the Snake River that impacted whether you could row there or not. So those were endless, right? right? But it didn't mean that it moved to the regional or the local levels. So the sport that's in the most local sports spaces and matters the most in most places is actually high school football. But you can only really motivate local communities through that. Unless there's this a pretty rare case that somebody in this class is from the Flint Creek area of Montana, Drummond or Phillipsburg. This photo will mean nothing from when the Flint Creek co-op team won the Montana 8-man football championship, Class C, a couple of years ago. So this is a really important thing. It brings the community together. They have actions and it matters. The mayors show up, etc. But it doesn't resonate. So what's in personal spaces works great on a personal level. You can motivate individuals. What's on a local level matters, and what's on a regional level matters. So you could take that Seahawks one and say that matters regionally and apply it there. It is true that team sports work better than individual sports. It doesn't mean that individual sports never matter, especially when there's a transcendent athlete. We'll look at that concept in the next two topics. But in this case, it's easier to get people to do things around individual sports if they translate themselves into team sports. So in the way that the America's Cup yachting race can be a U.S. versus some other entity, or Davis Cup tennis, or Solheim or Ryder Cup golf, where it's the U.S. versus Europe. These things matter. So there are folks who would know about Danielle Kang as an important golfer, an American golfer in the LPGA, the Ladies Professional Golf Association. But for other people, they'll pay attention to it because it's in the Solheim Cup. That doesn't mean there are no individual sports that'll matter. We'll look at boxing and some other things later. A lot of times, individual sports also get the importance is really through events and not through so much the sports themselves. So in this case, that would be true of figure skating, ice skating, where no matter how popular things appear, perhaps during a Winter Olympics or a world skating championship hosted not too many years ago in Spokane, by the way, and this one's when it was in Stockholm. Or in the Olympics with track and field, where people go really nuts for the event, or gymnastics or something like that. In this case, you'd back off and say, oh, it looks like it's not the sport that's in the space of the nation, it's the event. So a good example of this would be the United States women's soccer team, who comes onto the fore and is very popular. For example, when they won the World Cup in 1999, when they won in 2005, and then when they won in 15, and they won in 19. These are times when it really matters, but then the question is, do people turn out to watch their local teams play? And that's not usually the case, which would indicate that it's the team, the national team, and or more importantly, the World Cup or the Olympics that matters, not women's soccer. That doesn't mean that won't ever be true, but it is true right now. So on our case, then, what does it mean? We're going to try and measure that it matters. How do we know that it matters? So first, I'm going to ask you to read Tomlinson, Markovitz, and Young. You can also then get that definition that you're carrying around in your pocket, the pocket definition, and you're just reading it randomly and wowing and dazzling other individuals around you about what sports space is. Anyway, I may say that facetiously, but I hope you'll engage with it and come to understand it. So take that definition and maybe tape it up here next to your on the computer screen when you watch, especially when you watch the lecture for 2.2. Have the definition taped there, and as I go through the unit and explain it, see if it makes sense to you back and forth. And if you get to the end of Unit 2 or Topic 2 and it does make sense, fantastic. If not, call me up. So these are some things to keep in mind. It's the space that matters to many or most people. If you're looking at a national level, you need it to matter to the many or most people. The idea that they promote is that it's finite, that once it sort of gets filled by a sport, the space is taken up, and there can't be an infinite number of sports that matter on the national level. There can be sports and events, and that's a little bit different. We'll look at that going forward. It's not unchanging, so we'll look at the example of the U.S. about how boxing used to matter, how horse racing used to matter, and they don't now. For the sport to matter, it has to be more than event oriented, and it must generate passion on the part of X number of people. I don't know that number. It's not a magic thing, but the key is, does it impact decision making, travel, budget, etc. All right, so here's your takeaway. And I know sort of the takeaway is the definition that I want you to remember, but also it's the idea that different sports and events matter differently depending on the country in question and its sports space. So for our purposes for this class, we have to take it from the personal, local, regional, national to the international level. So you say, if you want to be predictive about what sports you could use if you wanted to, or what sports will be used if other states are interested in it, then you have to understand which ones matter and how they matter and what you can take advantage of. So keep that in mind as you go forward, and please be in touch if it doesn't make sense after 2-2. Cheers.